for being here. I really appreciate your interest in this project. You're interested in the subject matter most of all, but in the work as well. And I want to thank the Gallery Quds and especially Dagmar Painter, the interns, and the whole staff for the wonderful work. First, for the invitation to be here, because it's really a privilege to show my work here. I think this is such a unique place, and it really feels like home. I gave a talk here in October or November, early November, and it was such a wonderful thing to be back after having exhibited here, I can't remember when, 5 or 6 years ago. It was a while ago. So it's really nice to be back home. The title of my talk hopefully will become self-evident as I speak, but if not, we can talk about that during the discussion period. I'm going to show you images from a series of projects that have led to the work that is in the exhibit. I talked about the work in fairly good detail a few months ago, and at the end we'll have a discussion about the work instead of sort of a more formal presentation. But most of the work I'm going to show you are really selected from a few projects dating back to the mid-'80s that sort of show a history of engagement with the subject matter. And just to stay on track, I'm going to read parts of this. Is this showing up? Yeah. Otherwise, I'll ramble, and the half hour will go very quickly, and I'll still be on the second slide. Okay, I can see without these. For a little over 3 decades, my work has explored the aesthetics of instability. I've attempted to bring into visual expression the feelings of being pulled and pushed off balance, our struggle to reclaim an internal balance, our resistance to forces that undermine our stability. I've also explored our resilience and our ability to recover from psychological trauma. Instability, resilience, and resistance have been recurring motifs in my paintings and drawings, and in recent years have informed all of the work that I've done in photography and documentary filmmaking. The sources of instability that I address in my work are political, sociological, and psychological. The figures and the objects that I use are metaphors that guide the viewer to reflect on and to raise questions about the experiences presented. The images that I make are simultaneously beautiful and tragic. It's in that gap between the seemingly opposite experiences of beauty and tragedy that I feel most comfortable as an artist. The tension between beauty and tragedy, between desire and denial, between the decay and the possibilities of rebirth, is my way of reflecting through a range of visual media on the human potential for greatness, on our proclivity for self-destruction, and our impulse for the repression of others. The experience of displacement is one of the greatest sources of instability for an individual as well as a society that has been dismembered and forced into exile. Being stripped of one's home and homeland, denied one's identity and history, repeatedly rejected, humiliated, blamed for your own demise, and perpetually ignored and forgotten by a world that worships the powerful and disdains victims, is the experience of exile. For refugees, their passage in exile is simultaneously an experience of being static. I'm sorry, let me start the sentence again. For refugees, their passage in exile is simultaneously an experience of being static and in a state of constantly drifting in powerful currents beyond their control. Exile is the desire for the return and the yearning for a vehicle that could carry the displaced back to their shattered past. Exile is the denial of stability. The refugee's passage in exile is not confined to a single life, but defines the lives of generations. It's a state of physical absence and psychological presence. Exile is a condition of forced dormancy that contains within it the seeds of rebirth and the potential for the return. Drifting without volition, without control, without a sense of destiny, the refugee is inflamed and consumed by a passion that is often misconstrued and misdirected as rage. That passion is the torch that will light the people's journey out of the dark abyss of exile. Stripped of their identity and driven from their land, refugees live as ghosts, unseen and unheard, unknown and forgotten. They carry only memories and desires, and live as invisible silhouettes etched into the darkest shadows of history. Gouged out of their indigenous land and native traditions, the refugees exist as effigies of survival, simultaneously monumental and invisible. Stripped of their identity and driven from their land, the refugees drift from nowhere to nowhere, floating like ghosts in an endless sea of fog, forgotten survivors. They drift from a land denied to a land unknown. One, a dozen, 100, 1,000, hundreds of thousands, millions. If they exist at all, they exist like apparitions in the twilight of our consciousness, simultaneously present and absent, alternately seen and concealed, appearing and disappearing before our eyes, drifting from nowhere to nowhere, asking for nothing while needing everything. Forgotten survivors, stripped of their identity but not their humanity. They travel as restless corpses that refuse to die, flickering shadows that refuse to disappear. They carry nothing but memories and desires and drift from obscurity to darkness. They haunt us with their aesthetics of instability, appearing and disappearing before our eyes, carried by political currents from crises to tragedy, seducing us with the beauty of decay, mesmerizing us with the potential of rebirth, a tragic epiphany, piercing our hearts and blistering our minds. Remember the forgotten survivors as they appear simultaneously static and restless on the threshold of our consciousness. They search for balance between a past denied and a future unknown, requesting nothing and demanding everything. Drifting in a sea of misery, carried by waves of desire, sinking into the quicksand of denial. My work is informed by the study of history. The history of Palestinian displacement has been at the very core of my reflections on exile, on resistance, and survival. But the experience of forced exile is not unique to the Palestinians. And my visual reflections on the aesthetics of instability are not limited to the great catastrophe experienced by the Palestinians. As an activist artist, I like to use the term the artist as public servant to describe my relationship to my work. My objective as an artist, as a creative public servant, is not to transform a community, but rather to be transformed by that community. I want my work to challenge the belief and the tradition that the artist is a self-absorbed and self-serving thinker, or conversely, one whose work shapes world developments. The artist as public servant is one who extends herself into the community with the intention of learning from it, being shaped by it, and serving that community with his or her artwork. I want the viewer of my work to become witness to the unseen and listener to the unheard from the communities that have transformed me. So I try to learn, to witness, and to serve. All of the history books and all of the articles analyzing histories of displacement cannot compare with the stories of individuals that have lived that history. It is the stories of individual refugees, stories that I gathered directly in the fields of Palestine, as well as in the Palestinian refugee camps in neighboring Arab countries, that have reshaped my relationship with my work over the past few years. My encounters with the refugees have expanded my focus, the focus of my work, from the aesthetics of instability to the aesthetics of resistance. As an extension of my research and the community-based art projects that I implemented in Palestine, I began recording interviews with Palestinian refugees in 2006 and searched for and photographed their destroyed villages in different parts of Palestine. My drawings from the series Landscapes of Desire are inspired by the ruins of Palestinian villages and homes that were destroyed during and after the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The drawings are composed from photographs and video stills that I've taken in several destroyed Palestinian villages that I searched for and visited after interviewing survivors who were ethnically cleansed from those villages. Those Palestinian villages have been physically erased and their names wiped out from all official maps created after 1948. Most of those villages and towns have been renamed as Israeli towns, and all of their agricultural lands were confiscated, settled on, and cultivated by Israeli settlers who built new towns and kibbutzim on them. My drawings attempt to visualize the presence of absence in the Palestinian experience of displacement and exile. The drawings serve as meditations on the forced migration, dismemberment, and virtual disappearance of an indigenous people and their historical culture. The images are not representations of ruins, but stand as metaphors for the void created by the ongoing fragmentations of Palestine and the persistent desire of the displaced to reunify dispersed families and to rebuild their destroyed home and homeland. The images from this series, Landscapes of Desire, allow me to reflect on the concealed Palestinian landscapes of displacement that continue to be buried in the shadows of history. They allow me to reflect on and to partially expose the ongoing effort to annihilate a Palestinian culture that refuses to disappear and an indigenous people that refuse to be swept away. Drawings of the ruins of stone homes, shrines, mosques, and churches from devastated Palestinian villages such as Kufr Berem, El Bassa, Amka, and Quikat are a declaration that in the face of looming cultural annihilation, the persistence of memory is a crucial act of political resistance and cultural survival. When I walked through the destroyed villages in Palestine, they felt abandoned and haunted. I felt that the stones that formed the walls and arches of those once graceful buildings were alive. I felt that they spoke to me about the generations that were born in them and were sheltered by them. They told me of their history of denial, of being abandoned by their inhabitants, destroyed by the invaders, and neglected by the world. They spoke of having the very name and location of the village erased from maps and history so they would be forever forgotten. They whispered their fears of totally disappearing and of their desire to be reassembled and re-inhabited by the descendants of those who once built them. When I started to work on the drawings, I deliberately wanted to create images that were beautiful and visually seductive, images that would compel the viewer to stop and look, images that were familiar in their poetic representation of ruins, yet unclear as to their origin and history. I wanted to create images that would compel the viewer to have a visual and emotional response, even if that response was only initially triggered by a sense of poetic nostalgia or a seductive attachment to a romantic past. I wanted to create images that would allow the viewer to pause, to look, to feel, and to think. As far as I'm concerned, the seductive visual aesthetics of a work of art are the hooks that catch the viewer, pulls them out of their state of self-absorption, and reels them into the content of the work. Without that visual seduction, and emotional and intellectual engagement between the viewer and the artwork is much more difficult to achieve. I tried to create ghostly images, mirage-like landscapes that looked like they were in the process of disappearing or conversely emerging from an obscure past, suggesting a reality on the verge of vanishing or re-emerging before our very eyes. I wanted the viewer to wonder about the origins of the ruins and to be invited by their haunting and solemn beauty to approach the drawings and view them closely with the hope of obtaining meaning. Once the seduction occurs, the viewer approaches the drawing to inspect them from an intimate distance. I wanted her or him to be temporarily surprised by what they discovered, surprised by the fact that these landscapes have been constructed by one or two familiar words that have been repeated thousands and thousands of times on the page. I wanted the landscapes to speak to the viewer in a way that was similar to the way the stones spoke to me when I walked through the ruins of the villages. Close inspection of the drawings revealed that the repeating stamping of the words define all of the forms, the textures, the tones of the landscapes. Most importantly, the repeated words I employ to construct the drawings become a visual mantra, compelling us to remember, resist, return, rebuild, and even to prepare to forgive our opponents after truth, justice, peace, and reconciliation have been established. The words suggest the political content of the landscapes and make the viewer aware that the structures represented were not erased by the gentle passage of time, but by the violent hands of humans. The stamped words do not offer any answers. They only raise questions. Questions about the origin of the ruins, the process and period of their destruction, the destiny of the people who inhabited those once graceful stone structures, and the persistent call of the living stones, that is, the survivors of the ethnically cleansed villages, for recognition, for survival, for resistance, and for justice. I also wanted the viewer standing in front of my drawings to reflect on his or her personal and historical relationship to destruction and displacement. To think about his or her personal and ancestral history as part of a people who may once have been conquered and who may have been removed from their homes and homeland. Or conversely, to think about their history as people who were conquerors, who removed others from their homes and occupied their homeland. A Palestinian standing in front of my drawings reflect on the cultural genocide and physical devastation that was inflicted on him or her. A Native American or an African American would reflect on the massive genocide that decimated their societies and almost erased their histories. A European Jew would reflect on the incomprehensible violence inflicted upon them by their fellow Europeans, and would hopefully reflect on the tragic irony, possibly the greatest irony of the 20th century, that the generation of the Holocaust inflicted a cultural Holocaust on the Palestinians. The images are deliberately devoid of political and cultural references to Palestine. By avoiding images that are culturally specific, I hope to underscore the parallels between the struggle of the Palestinians and other persecuted people. The emotional and psychological impact of the drawings lay in their universal reference to surviving political and cultural traumas, the yearning to reclaim shattered past, and the desire to create a future that is free of persecution. The repeated words I employ to construct the images can be applied to most historical and contemporary political tragedies and invites each viewer to reflect on their moral responsibilities to ending a seemingly perpetual cycle of violence. The drawings are about injustice and violence inflicted on many cultures. The modern history of Palestine, defined by the forced displacement of its people, the ongoing attempted destruction of its culture and history, and its evolving liberation struggle are very important, but tragically not unique chapters in the history of oppression and resistance, a history of denial and desire. Without being literal or illustrative, my work bears witness to an ongoing and tragic history of Palestinian displacement. It urges us, that is, the Palestinian and their partners in the liberation struggle, to remember, to learn, to persevere, and to teach. It implores us to think creatively about our methods of resistance and to maintain the moral high ground in our struggle. It reminds us to reflect on and to practice an elevated level of compassion that has not been granted to us by our opponents or by their supporters. It guides us to think about a future beyond the liberation struggle, a future of rebuilding, healing, and reconciliation in a just society where all can live as equals. A few words on this project. So my objective with this project that you're seeing the photographs has been to record, to preserve, and to present the personal narratives and the life-forming experiences of 3 generations of Palestinian men and women who experienced the agonies of exile and the horrors of occupation. The majority of Palestinian refugees continue to exist for 65 years as unseen and unheard individuals living in the very margins of marginalized communities. The project is still a work in progress. It's been going on for a few years and hopefully will go on for a few more. And when completed, it will include a documentary film, or hopefully 2, the photographs that you're seeing in the exhibit. This is a small group from the larger series, a book that I'm working on that puts together the photographs with the narratives, drawings that I'm also working on, portraits, these allegorical portraits of the refugees, and what I think is really the core of the project is a video archive, an online archive of all of the interviews that I've been recording that will be freely available for students and scholars studying Palestine and the history of its people, because I think the most important thing is to learn right from the individuals. Preserving the stories of Palestine puts a human face, a living name, and unique sets of experiences on this ongoing refugee crisis. It humanizes and personalizes the abstract notion of the displaced masses, making the experiences of the refugees infinitely more real, comprehensible, and unforgettable. It individualizes Palestinian narratives of displacement, survival, and resistance, making them unquestionably tangible and irrefutable. For Palestinians living in exile as well as those living under occupation, memory is the engine of our return. Memory allows us to envision and to seek the denied security of our homeland. It enables us to creatively design the reconstruction of our shattered society. Memory inspires us to visualize a process to reassemble those tens of thousands of families that have been dismembered and globally scattered over 65 years of forced exile, occupation, and repression. My work on this project is but a small contribution to the very important task of preserving memories that have been deliberately denied and purposely ignored. It's a small effort to make the unseen seen and the unheard heard, so that we can never say, "I didn't know." So what I would